after we get going. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Danny Nelms. Again, I'm the CEO at Work Institute. Thank you for joining us today. This is the continuing series related to the release of our 2025 retention report, employee retention truth in today's workplace. We're excited about this year's retention report. As I've mentioned on a number of occasions, over the last several years, we've been really data heavy in our retention reports. And in our very first report, way back in 2017, we talked about the truths related to employee retention, and we decided to return to that theme this year. And we really looked at it in the context of what we call this emerging workforce. And so it was really exciting, and I think everybody that's been reading it has had great feedback and hope you enjoy it. Today, we want to talk about the predictive value of exit and stay interviews. I don't think we always think about these tools as predictive tools, and so we want to talk about that, talk a little bit about acting on it, and maybe some strategies for that. But I'm really excited to have a guest today. We did this once before, and we're going to do it a few times in our future webcast. But I'm really excited to have my good friend John Laster join me. John, how are you this morning?
Hey, Danny. Good morning. Hi, everybody.
So I was particularly interested in having John on board, and I'm going to ask him to give you just a little bit of his bio and his background. But his most recent role in a healthcare organization was really so closely related to what we do here at Work Institute. And one of the things that I like on a webcast like this is getting the practitioner view, somebody that's on the ground using some of the tools that we provide or other organizations provide, and talking through that and talking through the usefulness. And I couldn't think of anybody better than John to really talk about this. So John, if you don't mind, can you give the folks a little bit about your background and maybe tell them a little bit of detail around this most recent role you had?
Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you. Again, good morning, everybody. My name is John Laster. I'm kind of a career program manager and operations guy at heart. I like to work in, messy, high acuity situations where there's, things to fix, things to build, and been able to do that at some larger orgs like Lyft and Dell and Gaylord over the years. Most recently, I've been able to leverage that background and apply it in an HR and OD context in the healthcare space. I like to say I kind of help leaders retain employees by understanding maybe the employee experience in a way that leader can't. And so I get to spend my time consulting and advising leaders on workforce stability, employee engagement, and those fun spots. Most recently, the work Danny's referring to is a big healthcare company. I'll just let's say one of the largest national nonprofit healthcare companies in the country, big footprint here in Nashville, not headquartered here, but big footprint here. I had the opportunity to work on a team that was spun up a couple of years ago to do just that work, to go in there and help leaders see blind spots with regards to employee engagement and workforce stability. And our work, we spent time, we would go embed in organizations, in teams that had maybe high turnover or poor scores on some of the engagement surveys, things like that. And so our job was very similar to what Danny and his Work Institute team does. Our work is very similar to what they do, in that we have some objectivity with regard to maybe the team that we're assigned to go support. But what we had also a deeper contextual understanding. That was great, but it didn't always scale very well. So we can talk more about that in a little bit. But we would talk to the associates, talk to the frontline leaders, help them understand blind spots, deeper than just kind of a 5-point survey question, right? Like we were able to understand whys behind that and take that information back to the leader. I said earlier, I had the ability to go understand employee experience in a way that the leaders typically can't. So if I was asked to go engage maybe on an ICU floor where the night shift had a lot of turnover, the chief of nursing operations is not going to be able to walk down the floor and get that story. So my job was to go spend time and get that story. and created some eye-opening moments with what was typically some pretty simple. Trying to avoid saying low-hanging fruit because of it's such a cliche, but the easy button was right there a lot of times, and it was just sort of masked from the leaders. And so our job was to expose that, and then coach and support those leaders to go react and respond.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. And we're going to definitely get into more detail. We're going to talk about it really in the context of a couple of tools that Work Institute provides in exits and stay interviews. But it's always the case, we like to start with data. And so I want to spend just a couple of minutes here talking about some of our recent Work Institute data. And one of the things we always talk about are the rising costs. And so one of the things that I think most of us are feeling is that voluntary turnover in the US as a whole is actually declining somewhat. We hit that super high in 22 with the Great Resignation. Almost 50 million US employees left their jobs voluntarily. It's dropped back into the low 40 million range, which is still quite high historically. But we are seeing a little bit of decline. But we're also seeing a lot of data that's telling us that we've got pent up turnover, that people are interested in leaving, wanting to leave. In fact, Gallup said that almost 50% of the workforce is wanting to leave their job, but just due to what I would describe as instability in the workforce right now in terms of the economy and sort of the outlook and some of the things that are going on. I think people are hunkered down a little bit, even though they may not be satisfied with where they're at. But as you can see from the chart here, even though voluntary turnover is going down, the costs are rising, right? Inflation has affected everything from inflation in wages, which most of us would see as a pretty positive things, but everything that we do to recruit and hire people, whether it's background checks, credentialing, drug screening, advertising, recruitment fees, all of those things have increased substantially over the last several years. So the actual cost of turnover is actually on the rise, even though we've got some decline in overall voluntary turnover. We use 33% of base pay as our mechanism for calculating cost of turnover. It's a pretty conservative view, but that's just what we do. And certainly if anybody's ever interested, we can help you with that. And one of the notes we'll make, and I think it's more clear on one of our next slides, but a little over 75% of all reasons for turnover we think are somewhat preventable. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this chart. I know it's actually kind of busy. We're showing here the 5-year trends related to why people leave. And if you look to the far left, you can see that, career reasons still dominate in terms of why people are leaving. One thing I always like to point out is we have our total rewards here. And as you can see, even though that hit that high in 2022, it's actually been declining each of the last 3 years. And I think what I'm really pointing out these days in this is that, we have a lot of categories for leaving that are all, not vastly different. And so we really have to figure out what's going on in our workforce. John, would it surprise you at all that money is not why people typically are leaving organization? Is that a surprise to you?
It's not a surprise. But it was when I started doing this work, I showed up with that assumption, right? Let's just fix it with a checkbook. And the deeper I got into it, right, and it didn't take long. That's not why. And sometimes we saw in the healthcare organization that I was with, we saw folks leave initially. Their maybe initial stated reason was money. And when I say folks, I'm speaking of nursing population and all the adjacencies to that. Maybe they're going to leave and go to the hospital down the street for a couple of dollars more. Initially, we saw that, and then we saw them come back, usually within the year. And when they came back, they said, it's not about the money. In our case, we're a mission-driven organization, and that resonated more, and some of the other things resonated more with them. And so, while maybe in our case, the initial leave was for money, then they realized that actually wasn't the thing, and then they came back and they stayed and they grew. And so that's something that certainly fed back into the organization. We had to be careful with it, right? Because the organization, you had to be careful so that didn't become something that got leveraged to the detriment of the employees, and it didn't. But yeah, it's all the other things. It's uh, career pathways. It's all those things. How do I spend my time at work? And particularly in the healthcare space with nursing, you know, it's a vertical path in a lot of ways. You know, if I'm in the ICU and I want to go to do, there's different kinds of nursing, but within those spaces, um, you know, it's a vertical path more than one of breadth, and so that ultimately surfaced as reasons for turnover, and that became the challenge for the organization. But it certainly wasn't.
Absolutely. And if anybody wants to really dig into these a little bit more, again, I've got a QR code, I think, at the end to download the retention report. But it's easy to find. You just go to the Work Institute's website, workinstitute.com. There's a tab called Resources tab, retention reports, and it's there. You can download it for free. One other quick piece of data I wanted to share, and I'm sharing this for a couple of reasons. When we start to talk about exit and stay interviews and their predicted value, one of the things that we talk about is that exit interviews aren't always just about the reasons for leaving. It's also finding out perceptions around other key things in the organization. So we're here at Work Institute, we really focus on 4 core drivers of engagement and retention: the company as an employer, the manager, the team or the people I work with the most, and the job itself. And we'll talk about how these things can be predictive of reasons for leaving. But what I wanted to share here is actually the decline of most of these 4 drivers since 2020. We actually saw a more positive bump in 2020, which, again, I've talked about a lot about how surprised I was that employers did as well as they did during the pandemic. But outside of team making a little bit of a small recovery this year, we're actually seeing most of those on the decline, which marries up with, say, the Gallup data saying that, 50% of the workforce is interested in leaving, and also a lot of folks talking about just the decline in overall employee engagement. And our data tracks with their data in terms of what we're looking at there. So, John, I want to get into this predictive power of exit and stay interviews. And I know you and I've had some interesting discussions about this, even just recently. And I want to start with exit interviews because I think, one of the things that I've talked about repeatedly in here is a couple of things. One, that exit interviews are just a postmortem, and why am I interested in finding out why somebody left and what's going on with them because they're gone and I don't care anymore, or that it's kind of a trailing indicator that's not very useful. And one of the things that we feel like we've proven over and over and over again is that the reasons people leave are in fact predictive of why people are going to leave in the future if we're not acting on those reasons. And so it's such a critical piece of data that I think it's actually getting, I think it's actually seen as a diminished value these days for some reason. I think as we've gotten into these continuous listening models, we're just doing a throw in, exit interview survey that goes out and maybe 10 or 15% of the people fill it out. But John, I wanted to ask you, I mean, in practice, in the companies you've worked with, has this predictive value held true in terms of those reasons people leaving are actually reasons why people are going to consider leaving in the future?
Yeah, 100%. And again, I came into this work with that assumption, right? We don't really worry about the exit interview. That's lagging. They're gone. And what I learned very quickly again was the answers to the test were right there. Nobody was opening the book to look at it, right? And so because of that, that's where that reputation for that data as a lagging data point comes from. The reality is, in my experience, if let me think about it. Let me say this differently. It's lagging data only if you don't do anything with it, right?
That's a great point.
It's right there, just as anything. It's lagging data or it's ineffective data. What's the point of collecting the data if you're not going to learn from it? And that's the part that where my job, we had the opportunity to kind of pour gas on that fire. And there's a cyclical relationship. We've got we're probably talking about stay interviews here, and we've got stay interviews, we've got exit interviews. A lot of organizations that do both, not more should do both, but those that do both often, in my experience, run them as parallel paths as opposed to interconnecting them. And I think taking the output of the exit data and letting that maybe inform some of the ways we approach stay conversations. Oh my gosh, it's an absolute gold mine, and it uncovers so many things. I would also say, and Danny, we can talk about this now or another time in the call. So holler at me if you want me to push this piece. We tend to look at any of this stuff kind of through the negative lens, right? We go, okay, here's all the reasons they left. Those are bad things. Or with stay interviews, here's all the employee, annual surveys. Here's all the departments that did poorly. Let's go fix that stuff. Well, what we decided to do is look at that a little bit differently. We kind of flipped the script and said, okay, well, this survey is also telling us what's going well. And so why don't we go talk to those leaders? Why don't we go talk to those teams a little bit more and understand what's going well and see if we can use that to balance or mitigate the other feedback that we got. And we were able to do that and apply the what's going well stuff from our stay conversations and from our annual surveys and ongoing feedback. We're able to apply that to the low spots that were exposed through the exit interviews. And right, so we see how that, we see how we use one piece of data to support the other one. But again, the core of it is it's only valuable if you look at the data, right? It's what you do with it is separate, but you got to look at it and understand how you can apply that. Is that
No, John,
Danny, does that touch on that?
yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. And, we talk about it here at Work Institute. And I think if we've got some of our clients on today, they might be familiar with this, but almost every time we do a debrief with a client on their data, one of the things that we always try and start with is the strengths. What are the good things that we're hearing, right? And even when we look at reasons for leaving, and going back to what I stated about controllable or preventable and non-preventable reasons, sometimes even when we don't have high turnover, maybe we've only got 8 or 10% turnover, something that we feel like is healthy, but we have people leaving for reasons that we think are preventable. How do we shift those to more non-preventable kinds of things, right? We want people leaving for retirement reasons, or maybe they're just relocating with a spouse or those type of things. We don't want them leaving for work-life balance issues and career issues and pay issues that are much more controllable. So I think about it through that lens as well. And then from a stay interview perspective, John, because I know this is something you actually did a lot of, there's actually a psychological premise called, behavioral intent. And I think that a lot of times we feel like, well, employees are just saying that, or it's not data we can rely on. But there is a social construct around behavioral intent that's been used over and over and over in the survey world. So when people say that they are intent on leaving, there is some truth to that. Now, it can change. There are factors that can change almost day to day, sometimes hour to hour, that we can change that perception. So that's why we do put these continuous kind of listening things in place. But the stay interview is very much a great way to identify those risk factors as to why people are at risk of leaving. And I know you did that. And I wanted to go back and I want to get more on that, but I wanted to also say, we also hear somebody say either do stay interviews or do exit interviews. And I'm glad you talked about both of those, because they're kind of two sides of the coin. I don't even want to say they're two sides to the same coin. They're just two sides of the coin. And sometimes that data marries up perfectly, but sometimes it can be slightly different. And why people think they're going to leave versus why they ultimately leave can be different. So I think that's why both pieces of data, both collection methods, are really critical to do them both. But I want to go back to the stays data, stay interviews. And John, I mean, obviously we talk a lot about doing external stay interviews. You were embedded, you were in the organization, but you were doing these stay interviews. Talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, we just to set the stage, we had three hospitals, large hospitals here in this market, and there were 4 of me, I believe, and we had about 30 of us throughout the national footprint. And we we're embedded inside the HR org, and we would get kind of like a PMO. We would get assigned to a team in distress, and I used an ICU example before, and that was a real world example. Go find out what's going on here, right? And so I had the benefit of working there, and I wore the same badge as everyone else, and so I could go spend time there. And I would embed, like I went and I wore scrubs and I worked on the floor and I did lots of things that really was not on my bingo card when I got into this career field, from bedpans to moving things out of the way when codes were happening. I mean, it was unbelievable. And as an aside, the appreciation for what those people do, it's just incredible. But because I was there, I was able to ask lots of questions in a conversational way. I'm going kind of pivoting a little bit to kind of survey mechanics. We just talk to people, right? Like talk to them, and we were able to build rapport because we worked there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we were surveying, but we were surveying in a way that was meaningful. We were digging down multiple layers. I didn't just take their answer. It was, if a question was, and it might not have been this simple of a question, but are you actually thinking about leaving? Well, okay, well, why? Well, because of my manager or this or whatever else. Okay, tell me more about that. Is that really the thing? And we kind of would continue to peel the layers and captured all this data, like in real time. I mean, I'm doing court reporter kind of stuff, capturing all the data. And then we would package that up and provide that to the leader. We would identify key themes. And if we understand statistical, normalization, right? I'm going to talk to 100 nurses, and at the end of the day, it's going to be pretty easy to bucket that stuff into 5, 6, 7 key themes, and then provide that to the leaders. And boy, that's actionable data at that point. The challenge was, and I should tell you, I'm actually in career transition because we worked ourselves out of a job because we were good at what we did, but we weren't scalable. I told you, I go and I spent all this time. We weren't scalable, and at the end of the day, I know that I could have a massive impact on a surgical team. I went and spent 2 months with a surgical team, right? But that surgical team was one team at one hospital in one market. It doesn't scale very well the way we were approaching the work, and so I, bring in, an organization like what the work that Danny and his team do. I kind of think of it as sort of a force multiplier. Like I said, we were good, but we could only be, we were, what's the cliche? I'm going to get this backwards. We were able to go a mile deep, inch wide. Work Institute is able to go kind of mile deep, mile wide. And so that idea of a force multiplier, they can take the work that I was able to do, that my team was able to do, and apply it a lot more broadly across the organization. Take that stay data, marry it up with exit data, and see where those connections are. And again, it creates those aha moments for the leaders. Now, how they go act on that, what the leader does with that, that's another piece. But just simply exposing those data points to the leaders. I mean, they're heads down, they're working. You all are heads down, you're working. It's no one's fault that that we don't see things that are right in front of our face. Because if the thing that's right in front of my face isn't the thing that I'm paid to go do in a literal sense, I'm not going to see this other thing that's just right off to the side. So that's where this work, in my opinion, I think that's where this work is so important. Danny, does that help?
Oh, it's great. And again, I as we talked about, I just like to hear your truth and what was going on the ground. And I love that term force multiplier, because I think there's some truth in that, because we do provide some scalability. And although I love what you were doing, John, in terms of that very conversational stay interview, one of the things that Work Institute does is we do add more structure to it. So we are consistent with our questions in our stay interviews and our exit interviews for that matter. What that does is it actually provides us a mechanism to provide very detailed reporting, so we can go that mile wide, right? So if we're looking at a much broader segment, what, if any, themes actually start to get shared across either multiple departments, multiple locations, right? Some of those things start to look broader. And then we can start to use scale to try and see if there's ways we can solve those problems. Now, I've always said retention is local or turnover is local. And so, it's not always going to be like enterprise down type solutions, but we can start to see the broader themes and start to see if we can speed up the process of driving retention if we can see broader themes. And it looks like you've got John to say something, John. I'm gonna let you have at it.
You touched on something there, and that's I'm gonna get your phrasing wrong, but the consistency of application, the consistency of questions that you guys do. If there was a misstep for the way our team worked, and it was because we were in the organization. Now, I had objectivity in that I didn't work for the for the surgical units or the ICUs or wherever I might be assigned, but so I was able to have objectivity to that degree that helped. But I had too much contextual background, and that's something that you all, speaking to working through, that's something you all would not necessarily have. And I think that's a good thing, because me having too much context would lead us, we kind of, the old phrase of where the day takes you. Our conversations sort of went with the breeze. And if this associate wanted to talk about whatever, and that became, boy, we'd go deep there, because I had I work here too, and I don't want you to have this bad experience. And, you kind of take some ownership around it. And that's great. And we created meaningful interactions with that. But there was absolutely, there was a lack of consistency. And so it did become a challenge for us to kind of marry up some of that data. If we split a department between me and maybe two of my other partners, it was a challenge. I told you earlier we could bucket that stuff, but it was a lift to come back and bucket it, because despite our attempts to ask the same questions and to provide some consistency there, because we were there, because we lived there with them, that also made it tough. And so we didn't do a great job striking that balance. Danny's team can take that objectivity and turn that into consistent in terms of application. So
yeah,
I thought of that before too. You mentioned that, Danny.
Yeah, and one point I've made hundreds of times, and I want to make it again. And again, I love the work that John was doing, and I think I that's again why he and I've had a lot of conversations. I do think there's the scalability concern. I always want to say that I don't ever want to dissuade organizations from creating powerful, good conversations between the manager and the employee, potentially in a stay interview concept, or even HR and the employee in a stay interview. The challenge is when we actually have high turnover, when we have turnover concerns, unfortunately, either of those parties, either the manager is part of the problem, and it's not going to uncover that, or HR comes in with certain biases that are blind spots that they come in with. And the one thing that Work Institute provides is that objectivity, right? We're coming in as an objective third party. We just want to know the truth. We just want to know what's going on. And I think that's, I don't suggest really that we go in and do stay interviews with a really thriving team that's doing well and doesn't have high turnover. I don't think that's where we're best suited. I think we're the scalpel that comes in when there's a problem on the stay interview side. And I want to jump back to exit interviews, but yeah, I just wanted to make that point. One quick thing on exit interviews, John, and I know you and I have talked about this. I think we get really focused on the reasons for leaving, and granted, that is one of the most important things. By the way, I need to pause for a second. If anybody has questions, throw them in the chat. We're going to try and wrap up here in the next 5-10 minutes. I know we've been trying to keep these a little shorter because everybody's just so busy. But if you've got a question or a comment, feel free to throw it in the chat and we'll get to it. But John, on exit interviews, I think sometimes we don't pay attention enough to the other questions that we're asking in that exit interview, because we ask about the manager, we ask about the job, the team, the company as an employer. We actually ask, would they be willing to return? You talked about people that return back to your organization. We ask if they tell us where they went and why they went there. So those are also extremely valuable information that we use to fill in this story around why people are leaving. How have you seen that additional information be valuable to you?
It was valuable to us because we learned, it helped us understand the things that we did well. And it helped us also understand, maybe I'm going to say, it kept us from chasing our tail a little bit.
Okay.
It identified maybe if somebody left for a reason that was out of our control, um, and if maybe a handful of folks left for a reason that was out of our control, and that was centralized in a specific unit, it helped us understand, like, is that a problem we can fix, as opposed to just blindly chasing a retention problem, right? That maybe we had no hope of fixing, but we didn't know it had we not asked that question. And then the other piece of the other thing that those questions circle back to is the talent acquisition side. Like, are we asking the right questions the first time we interact with that person, right? Were they? This might sound horrible to put it this way, but I've had enough coffee and I'm not going to think of a nicer way. But it helps us understand, should that person have been here in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean that mutually, right? But should they have been here in the first place? So exit interviews for us were leveraged to come all the way back to the talent acquisition side. If we saw key themes that could be addressed on the front end, helps a ton. Helps an absolute, my gosh. I mean, that's a whole other, Danny, it's a whole other webinar.
Yeah, absolutely.
on the benefits of getting it right to begin with. But those are two other areas. It kept us from chasing our tail and trying to fix a problem that was out of our purview. And then it helped us. It provided more input to tighten up things on the recruiting side.
So I want to go back on the stay interviews again. I know we've been talking about those a lot, but I wanted to, and for those of you on this webcast that aren't really familiar with Work Institute, one of the things you said, John, was that you went in and you actually, were just having a discussion with an employee. Your stay interview was a little more unstructured, but you were just having a conversation. And I mentioned we have these set, more structured questions that we have. But one of the things that we do is and I love using manager just because it's simple, but when we ask, how would you rate your manager? They got a 5-point Likert scale. It's excellent, very good, good, fair, poor. And we actually follow up in a couple of different ways. If it's excellent, we're saying, why was your manager excellent? So going back to your strengths, right? Going back to celebrating and knowing what we're good at, right? We know what to tell the manager they're doing well. If it's a fair or poor rating, we're also asking why. Why did you rate them fair or poor? So it's a remediation. What do we need to fix within the manager that's there? And then if it's good or very good, it's what would it take to get to excellent? So we're following up with all of these rating questions with saying why. Why did you rate it this way? Or what would it take to get to excellent? And that's how we build that contextual information that I think is pretty close to what you were doing in your more unstructured way. But can you talk to whether you think there's strengths or weaknesses to the two different approaches?
Yeah, you have to do it that way. I mean, I just feel so strongly, and perhaps a bit draconian. What you just laid out is the only way to get useful, meaningful data. If I had shown up with my clipboard, and I didn't use a clipboard, but if I had just shown up with a clipboard and taken a survey, just doing that verbally and filling in the box on the Likert scale, it's useless. It's absolutely useless, because the second question of the what would it take, as I've looked at how you all approach things, the what would it take, I think why is an easy question to ask, and that's there, but the what would it take to move the needle, boy, that's the powerful stuff. Because then as an organization, if I have that feedback, I now, like, you're just handing over the actionable playbook at that point. This is what it would take. Like, everybody was here, we need to move them to there, and this is what it would take, right? That's the power of that question. And we would ask that question in a couple of different ways. I alluded earlier to maybe we were too contextual and just kind of going with the wind with that conversation. But ultimately, we're trying to get to that same actionable stuff. So for an outside organization with that absolute objectivity to be able to have a conversation and say what would it take to move the needle, or what would it have taken, however that gets framed up. I mean, think about it. If you're in a leadership position, wouldn't you love to have the answer to that? I mean, that's the stuff that we don't know. Like, what would it have taken for you to stay?
Right.
Or in a stay interview, honest question, are you truly thinking of leaving? Like, what would it take for you to not do that?
Sure.
Man, yeah, I'm sorry, that's a passion area of mine, and I've got some pretty strong feelings about that.
Oh, no, well, that's why you're on, because I know how passionate we both are about this topic. One of the things I want to, just a couple of little common mistakes, maybe the things we need to avoid or best practices. I want to go back to this idea. Again, I keep going back and forth between exits and stays, and they're both, to me, again, both critical retention factors. They're tools at our disposal that we need to be using. One of the things that we talk a lot about in exit interviews is there's two factors that really drive authenticity. One is timing, right? So the best time to conduct an exit interview is after the employee's left. They're going to be more authentic. They're going to be more honest. They don't feel like they're going to burn a bridge. And two is having that objective third party that they're going to be more honest with. And John, I know in your case, even though it wasn't Work Institute, you had that external exit interview data at your disposal.
Yep.
Did you feel more confident in that data because it was collected in the way it was collected, that you had the truth, if you will?
Yeah, I'm going to say kind of both sides of that. One is we transitioned from doing the exit surveys in-house to going with an external vendor, and absolutely we got better data by doing that. Our HR business partners didn't have time and often weren't equipped to do meaningful exit surveys, and there's inherently some bias, and maybe those, the person that just hands you the exit package is also the one giving you an exit survey. It's messy, and so we got better feedback once it went external. I'm then going to also say it wasn't as good as it could have been because it was just a survey and nobody asked what it would take. So we got a little bit of a lift, but I kept going, okay, but it's not enough, right? Like, it's not enough. And, I wasn't in charge of some of that process. So I had, I didn't have the influence I wanted to have there to bolster that. I even tried to do it in-house and said, okay, well, can we take this data and can our team follow up with these folks that have left and ask those follow-up, what would it take questions? But yeah, so taking it out of house, taking it externals was an absolute home run. Let me take that back. Taking it external was kind of a, maybe it was a double to the gap. The home run would have been being able to have follow-up questions to the surveys.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And again, I'm gonna throw a shameless plug in here, which I try not to do, but I just can't help myself in this particular instance. But as I've explored other companies out there that do what they call a telephonic interview or a telephonic survey, at the end of the day, when you really dig under the hood, so to speak, they're just doing a telephonic survey. They're not actually doing an interview. We're one of the few remaining companies that at scale does an actual behavioral exit interview. We're asking for reasons. We're asking for another reason, which one's most important. We're following up on our core driver questions. We're getting all those whys. It is an actual interview. Now it's structured, right? It's not just this, random interview that's going on that can go any direction. We provide structure to it, but we are digging for that detail. And that's what you're saying would have been I love what you said earlier. I'm going to repeat it a million times. You're the first person I've ever heard call Work Institute a force multiplier. But that contextual data is an additional force multiplier, right? It gives you so much power in understanding what's going on.
our leaders didn't know. And I think probably lots of folks don't know they're missing that until the opportunity is presented to them. I've got exit survey data. Here's all this data we got. I said, okay, but we don't know what it would have taken for them to stay. We don't know what it would have taken to move the needle. Oh my gosh, the looks we got in the room when I posed that. I said, how do we know what would have taken? Like, it's great that they said their manager is whatever they said, but we don't know what it would have taken. And and that just created kind of, oh my gosh, why didn't we think about that? It was those kind of things. And it wasn't to throw anybody under the bus. It was just like, yeah, this is better, but can't really do a whole lot with it still. So I've got X number of people that left and said they left for whatever reason. Okay.
Yeah.
It just wasn't actionable.
Sure. Well, gosh, John, I knew this would happen. We're at 41 minutes and we said we're going to try and keep this to 30, 35. I knew it would happen because I enjoy talking to you so much and we have so many things in common. And I really appreciate the fact that you were giving me your truth in terms of what it was like on the ground, and how it worked well in some cases, but how it could have been better. I think Work Institute can provide some to that. But I want to just remind our audience, by the way, I got a question. Can you please provide us with sample stay and exit surveys? Lauren, if you'll reach out directly to me, Danny Nelms at workinstitute.com, you can find me anywhere. I've got a couple of documents I think I can provide you that have most of our questions on them. So if you'll reach out to me via email or LinkedIn or however you can find me, I'm happy to do that with some sample stay and exit surveys. But again, I want to just reiterate, exit and stay interviews are predictive tools. We can predict why people are going to leave. We can predict why people are going to leave in the future using our exit data. So I think that's one of the things that we have to change our mindset around, not think about exit interviews as lagging indicators or other data. One of the things that I think you talked throughout, John, that we didn't get into a lot of detail, but I love what you said up front, which is if you're just going to collect data and let it sit around, don't do it at all. We need to be acting on that data. But just in 30 seconds, John, any final points you'd love to make? I can't talk now.
Yeah, I think, and I'll try to do this quick here. I think of, like, if we think about our employees as customers, it might be a weird approach, or a weird take, but we've all been that customer. Where we're a lifelong customer or a multi-year customer of a company, and we see all these promos. I guess Xfinity and others do it, and I apologize if we've got Xfinity folks on the call. I don't mean it that way, but we see where maybe somebody that we have a long relationship with spends a lot of time offering deals and attraction to get new customers. Those promos aren't available for existing customers, right? How does that make you feel? I'm getting ready to make a change for that very reason. Product is great, everything's great. I don't like the fact that I can't participate in some of the fancy new stuff simply because I've already been there and that I'm not new. What if we think about employees like that? They're going to leave, right? And we're not going to know about it till it's too late. And if we don't get the data, and if we don't ask about what it would have taken or what it would take, then we don't have any way to do anything about it, right? To keep the next one from leaving. So that's John's story time.
Great, John. John, thanks again so much. I appreciate it. For everybody on the screen, you've got a QR code here. You can register for our upcoming webcast next week, how feedback standards fail to deliver business success. This is all about how we're using rating scales and favorable ratings. I'm going to do a pretty, I don't know how deep I'm going to get, but it is a pet peeve of mine, and I'm going to talk about all the reasons why it is. But John, thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining me this morning. Really appreciate your participation. Again, feel free to reach out to me directly, Danny Nelms at workinstitute.com. I'll put my email address in the chat. You can find me on LinkedIn, and hopefully we'll see you at a future webcast. John, have a great day. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, everybody.